The screaming stopped after 3 days, not because the victim died. That would have been merciful. The human body, it turns out, has a breaking point where the vocal cords simply give out, where the throat becomes so raw that even the most unimaginable agony can only produce a wet, rasping wheeze. The executioners at the Tower of London knew this intimately. They kept detailed records. Time of first scream, time of confession, time when the voice failed, time when the eyes went blank but the heart kept beating. You've seen medieval torture devices in movies, the Iron Maiden with its spikes, the rack stretching bodies until joints pop. But those Hollywood props don't capture what really happened in those stone chambers beneath European castles. The actual instruments were far more sophisticated, more calculated. The men who designed them understood anatomy with the precision of surgeons, knew exactly how much pressure a femur could take before splintering, exactly where to place a metal edge to keep someone conscious for days while their body was systematically destroyed. Let me walk you through 11 devices that redefined human suffering, starting with one that was so effective, so precisely cruel, that condemned prisoners would bite through their own tongues rather than face it. The rack. The rack looked deceptively simple, just a wooden frame with rollers at each end, ankles tied to one roller, wrists to the other. Turn the crank, and the body stretches. But the Duke of Exeter knew exactly what he was doing when he brought this device to the Tower of London in 1420. The executioner's assistant would place his hand on your chest, feeling for that precise moment when your breathing changed, when your body realised what was about to happen. Then came the first turn of the crank. The rope would go taut with a sound like a ship's rigging in a storm. Your shoulders would burn as they pulled against their sockets. But this was just the greeting, the introduction. The real work began with the second turn, then the third. Your spine would elongate, vertebrae separating with wet pops that echoed off the stone walls. Witnesses described hearing sounds like green wood breaking. That was the cartilage between your ribs tearing apart. Your hip joints would dislocate with a grinding sensation that victims said felt like their bones were full of broken glass. Anne Askew faced the rack in 1546. The Protestant martyr was an educated woman, well-spoken, who'd already endured preliminary questioning. When they stretched her on the rack, something unprecedented happened. The regular torturer refused to continue. He said her joints had already separated, that going further would kill her. So the Lord Chancellor himself took over, cranking the device until Anne's shoulders and hips completely dislocated, until her elbows hyperextended backward. They had to carry her to her execution on a chair, because her body could no longer support itself. She never gave them a single name. But here's what the movies never show you, the aftermath for those who survived. Once your ligaments were stretched beyond their breaking point, they never fully recovered. Victims would spend the rest of their lives with joints that would dislocate from something as simple as reaching for a cup. Their spines remained elongated, leaving them inches taller but unable to stand straight. The nerve damage was permanent. Some developed a condition where their bodies would suddenly contort in agony years later, muscles trying to protect joints that would never heal. Yet compared to what came next, the rack was almost merciful. At least it was quick. The Spanish donkey. The Spanish donkey could last for days. Imagine a triangular wooden beam, the edge honed to a knife-like wedge, mounted on legs like a sawhorse. Now imagine being forced to sit astride it, naked, your full body weight pressing down on your groin. The victim would be lifted onto the device, legs on either side of the sharp wedge. Within minutes, the edge would begin cutting into the soft tissue of the perineum. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. Victims described it as having a sword slowly pushed up through their body. But the torturers weren't satisfied with just gravity. They would tie weights to the victim's ankles. 20 pounds at first, then 40, then 60. Each added weight drove the wedge deeper. The genius of the device, if you can call such cruelty genius, was that it attacked the most nerve-rich area of the human body while keeping the victim fully conscious. Men would feel their scrotum split like overripe fruit. Women experienced their pelvic bones actually separating under the pressure. The weight would eventually cause the wooden edge to cut so deep that it would reach the tailbone, sometimes splitting it in two. One account from the British Navy notes that after just 2 hours, a man's ability to father children was permanently destroyed. After 4 hours, victims lost control of their bladder and bowels permanently. The the nerves controlling those functions severed by the wooden edge. After 6 hours, the pelvis itself would begin to crack. The Spanish Inquisition had a special fondness for using this device on women accused of adultery or witchcraft. They would sometimes coat the wooden edge with salt or vinegar, adding a burning chemical agony to the mechanical splitting. One inquisitor's journal describes leaving a woman on the device for 3 days. By the end, the wooden edge had cut so deep that her hip bones were visible on either side of the beam. Those who survived, and many didn't, dying from blood loss or infection, were left permanently mutilated. They walked with a distinctive waddle, their pelvises never properly healing. Many couldn't sit normally for the rest of their lives. The psychological damage was equally severe. Victims reported nightmares decades later where they felt themselves being split apart again. But if the Spanish donkey destroyed from below, the next device attacked the very seat of human identity, the skull itself, the head crusher. The head crusher was elegantly simple: a metal cap over the skull, a bar under the chin, and a screw that brought them together. The victim would be seated, their chin placed on the lower bar. The metal cap would be positioned on top of their head, often with ceremonial slowness, letting them fully understand what was about to happen. Then the torturer would begin to turn the screw, just a quarter turn at first. The pressure would build across the skull like the world's worst headache. Another quarter turn. The victim's molars would begin to ache as their jaw was compressed. This is where the true horror began. As the pressure increased, the weakest parts of the skull would give way first. Teeth would explode from the pressure, shooting out of the victim's mouth like bullets. The jawbone would splinter, fragments of bone piercing through the cheeks. But the torturer would keep turning. The human skull can withstand about 520 pounds of force before it begins to fracture. The head crusher could deliver over 1,500 pounds. As the pressure mounted, the skull would begin to deform. The temporal bones above the ears would crack first, followed by the occipital bone at the base of the skull. Witnesses described hearing sounds like walnuts being crushed. Then came the eyes. The build-up of pressure inside the skull had nowhere to go. The eyeballs would bulge outward, straining against the sockets. With one more turn of the screw, they would pop out entirely, dangling by the optic nerves. Some versions of the head crusher had small dishes positioned to catch them. The victim would still be conscious at this point, blind but aware, feeling their skull slowly collapsing like an egg in a vice. The Spanish Inquisition's records describe using the head crusher on a Protestant minister in 1563. They turned the screw just enough to crack his teeth and fracture his jaw, then stopped. They left him in the device for 6 hours, occasionally tapping the metal cap with a hammer to send shockwaves of agony through his breaking skull. When they finally released him, his face was so deformed that his own wife couldn't recognize him. He confessed to whatever they wanted. Those who survived a session with the head crusher, and the device was often used just short of lethal force, lived with devastating injuries, shattered jaws that never properly healed, permanent blindness from damaged optic nerves, skull deformities that caused constant pain and pressure. Many suffered from seizures for the rest of their lives, their damaged brains never recovering from the trauma. Yet even the head crusher pales compared to the calculated sadism of the next device. The Judas Cradle. Picture a pyramid, 3 feet tall, made of iron, the point sharpened to a tip no wider than a fingertip. Now picture being suspended above it, naked, your legs spread, as you're slowly lowered onto that point. The Judas Cradle transformed gravity into an instrument of intimate destruction. The victim would be hoisted up by ropes, their legs pulled apart and secured. The pyramid's tip would be positioned directly below their anus or vagina. Then, with agonizing slowness, they would be lowered. The tip would first touch, then press, then penetrate. The victim's own body weight would drive the pyramid deeper, stretching and tearing the most sensitive tissues of the human body. But the torturers had refined this process into an art. They wouldn't just drop the victim onto the pyramid. That would be too quick. Instead, they would lower them an inch at a time. The tip would enter just far enough to cause excruciating pain, but not immediate fatal damage. They would hold the victim at that height, sometimes for hours, their leg muscles cramping and failing as they tried desperately to support themselves. Some versions of the Judas Cradle were heated. The pyramid would be placed over burning coals until it glowed a dull red. The victim would feel the heat rising as they were positioned above it, knowing what was coming. When they were finally lowered, the burning metal would cauterize tissue as it tore through, preventing blood loss that might bring the mercy of unconsciousness. The Spanish Inquisition employed the Judas Cradle extensively during the 16th century. One account describes a woman accused of witchcraft who was subjected to the device for 12 hours. The torturers would repeatedly lift and drop her onto the pyramid, each drop driving it deeper. By the end, the iron pyramid had torn through her rectum and into her abdominal cavity. She survived another 3 days before dying of septic shock. The damage inflicted by the Judas Cradle was catastrophic. The pyramid would destroy the anal sphincter, leaving survivors permanently incontinent. It would tear through the wall between the rectum and vagina in women, creating fistulas that would never heal. The stretching and tearing of internal tissues caused massive infections. Many victims died days or weeks later from peritonitis, as bacteria from torn intestines spread through their abdominal cavity. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of the Judas Cradle was its sexual nature. This wasn't just torture, it was rape by an inanimate object, a violation so profound that many victims were left unable to speak about their experience. The shame and trauma persisted long after the physical wounds had healed, if they ever did. The breast ripper. The breast ripper took this sexualized cruelty even further, creating a device specifically designed to mutilate women. Made of iron, it consisted of 4 claws that could be heated until they glowed red. The claws would be clamped onto a woman's breast, penetrating the flesh with their sharp points. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, the torturer would pull. The claws would tear through skin, fat and mammary tissue, literally ripping the breast from the woman's body. This wasn't done quickly. The torturer would pull slowly, sometimes taking minutes to fully remove the breast. The victim would feel every fibre of tissue tearing, every blood vessel rupturing. If the claws were heated, the smell of burning flesh would fill the chamber as the metal seared through tissue. Some women passed out from the pain. They would be revived with cold water and the process would continue with the other breast. The breast ripper was reserved for women accused of adultery, witchcraft or other crimes against morality. It was both torture and symbolic punishment, an attack on the very symbols of womanhood and motherhood. The wall-mounted version, called the Iron Spider, was even more brutal. The woman would be secured with her breasts pressed against the spiked claws mounted on the wall. Then she would be pulled away, leaving her breasts behind, still impaled on the device. A documented case from the 15th century Germany describes a woman accused of adultery who faced the breast ripper. The device was heated until it glowed white hot. When the claws penetrated her breast, witnesses said the sizzling sound could be heard throughout the torture chamber. The torturer pulled so slowly that it took nearly 10 minutes to fully remove the breast. The woman survived but died 3 days later from infection. Her chest cavity opened to the bone. Those few who survived the breast ripper were left permanently disfigured. Beyond the obvious physical mutilation, many suffered from chronic infections as the wounds rarely healed properly. The psychological trauma was equally severe. These women were marked forever, their mutilation a visible sign of their supposed crimes. Many were shunned by society, unable to marry or remarry, condemned to live as outcasts. The pear of anguish. The pear of anguish brought torture inside the body itself. Shaped like a pear and made of metal, this device consisted of 4 segments that could spread apart via a screw mechanism. In its closed position, it was smooth enough to insert into a body cavity. Once in place, the torturer would turn the screw, causing the metal segments to expand outward like the petals of a deadly flower. The pear had different applications depending on the supposed crime. For blasphemers and heretics, it would be inserted into the mouth. As it expanded, it would dislocate the jaw, tear the corners of the mouth and potentially break teeth and bones. For women accused of witchcraft or adultery, it would be inserted vaginally. For homosexual men, anally. In each case, the expansion would tear delicate internal tissues, causing excruciating pain and permanent damage. The genius of the pear, again if such evil can be called genius, was that it could be precisely controlled. A quarter turn might cause discomfort, a half turn would bring serious pain, a full turn would tear tissue, multiple turns could cause ruptures that would never heal. The torturer could expand it, leave it in place for hours, then expand it more. An account from the Spanish Inquisition describes using the pear of anguish on a woman accused of consorting with the devil. The device was inserted vaginally, and expanded slowly over the course of 6 hours. Each turn of the screw brought fresh agony as tissues stretched and tore. By the end, the internal damage was so severe that she hemorrhaged continuously for days. She confessed to everything they accused her of, but died a week later from infection. The internal nature of the damage made the pair of anguish particularly insidious. Unlike external wounds that could be seen and potentially treated, the internal tearing often led to infections that were impossible to combat with medieval medicine. Victims who survived often suffered from fistulas, abnormal connections between organs, that left them incontinent or in constant pain. The breaking wheel. The breaking wheel turned execution into public theatre. The victim would be tied to the wheel, their limbs threaded through the spokes. Then the executioner would systematically break their bones with an iron hammer, starting with the shin bones and working up to the arms. The wheel would then be hoisted upright and mounted on a pole, leaving the victim exposed to the elements. With their limbs shattered and woven through the spokes at unnatural angles, they would hang there, still alive, sometimes for days. Crows would peck at their eyes. Insects would lay eggs in their wounds. The crowd would watch as the victim slowly died from shock, dehydration, or exposure. The number of blows was often specified by the judge. A merciful execution might include a blow to the chest or neck to kill the victim quickly. But for the worst crimes, the executioner was instructed to avoid fatal blows, ensuring the victim would suffer on the wheel for as long as possible. In 1589, Peter Stump, known as the Werewolf of Bedburg, was executed on the breaking wheel. Accused of werewolfery, murder and cannibalism, his execution was particularly brutal. First, flesh was torn from his body with red-hot pincers. Then his arms and legs were broken in 10 places. Finally, he was beheaded and his body burned. But before the beheading, that merciful end, he spent hours on the wheel, his broken body contorted into an impossible pretzel of agony. The public nature of the breaking wheel served a purpose beyond punishment. It was a warning, a spectacle designed to terrify the population into obedience. The broken body on the wheel would be left on display for weeks, a rotting reminder of the price of defying authority. Birds would nest in the ribcage. The bones would bleach in the sun. Eventually, only a skeleton would remain, still woven through the wheel's spokes. Yet even the breaking wheel's public agony couldn't match the efficiency of the next method, the saw torture, the saw. Such a simple tool, found in any carpenter's workshop. But hang a person upside down, position a 2-man saw at their groin, and it became one of the most horrific execution methods ever devised. The victim would be suspended by their ankles, ensuring blood flow to the brain that would keep them conscious far longer than if they were upright. The executioners would begin sawing at the groin, the blade cutting first through the genitals, then into the pelvis. The inverted position meant the victim wouldn't pass out from blood loss quickly. The heart would keep pumping blood to the brain even as the lower body was being bisected. Some victims reportedly remained conscious until the saw reached the navel. The process was deliberately slow. The executioners would use a methodical back and forth motion, each stroke of the saw cutting a little deeper. They would sometimes pause to clear bone dust from the blade, prolonging the agony. The victim would feel everything, the saw teeth tearing through skin, grinding through the pelvic bone, rupturing organs one by one. An account from medieval Persia describes a prince who was executed by sawing. The executioners were instructed to saw slowly enough that he would survive until the blade reached his chest. It took over an hour. Witnesses said he screamed for the first 20 minutes, then made only gurgling sounds as blood filled his throat. But his eyes remained open and moving until the very end. The horror of saw torture wasn't just in the pain, but in the complete destruction of the body. Unlike other execution methods that left a corpse that could be buried, sawing left 2 halves of a human being. These would sometimes be displayed separately, hung on different gates of the city as a warning. But perhaps no torture device has captured the imagination and horror quite like the next one. The Iron Maiden, the name itself sounds almost romantic. The Iron Maiden, like something from a dark fairy tale. But the reality was pure nightmare. A human-shaped sarcophagus made of iron, its interior lined with spikes positioned to penetrate the body at dozens of points when the door was closed. The spikes were arranged to pierce the victim without immediately hitting vital organs, ensuring a slow death from blood loss and organ failure. The most famous Iron Maiden was in Nuremberg, Germany. It had spikes specifically positioned to pierce the eyes, throat, heart and groin. The victim would be forced inside and the door would be slowly closed. As it shut, the spikes would penetrate the body from all directions. The victim would be trapped in absolute darkness, impaled in dozens of places, bleeding out slowly while their screams echoed inside the metal coffin. Some accounts claim the Iron Maiden had acoustic pipes that would carry the victim's screams outside while distorting them, making them sound inhuman. Others say the spikes were arranged to miss major arteries, ensuring the victim would live for hours or even days inside the device. The door might be opened periodically to check if the victim was still alive, then closed again to continue the torture. The Iron Maiden combined claustrophobia, penetration trauma, and slow death in one horrific package. Being slowly impaled by dozens of spikes while trapped in a metal coffin captures something fundamental about our deepest fears. It represents the extremes of human cruelty, the point where creativity was turned entirely toward creating suffering. Impalement. Impalement was absolutely horrifically real. Vlad III of Wallachia, better known as Vlad the Impaler, turned this execution method into his signature. The process was methodical. A wooden stake, about as thick as a man's arm and 8 to 10 feet long, would be prepared. The tip wouldn't be too sharp, that would kill too quickly. Instead, it would be rounded, sometimes greased. The victim would be laid on the ground. The stake would be inserted into the anus or vagina, then carefully driven through the body. This is where Vlad's expertise became evident. His executioners knew exactly how to insert the stake to avoid immediately fatal damage. They would maneuver it past vital organs, threading it through the body cavity like a grotesque medical procedure. The stake would emerge somewhere near the neck or shoulder. Then the stake would be planted upright in the ground, leaving the victim suspended in the air, gravity slowly pulling them down onto the spike. Death could take days. The victim would slide down the stake millimetre by millimetre, their own weight driving it deeper. They would die from a combination of factors: blood loss, septic shock, dehydration, exposure. Birds would begin feeding on them while they still lived. In some cases, a wooden block would be attached to the stake to prevent the body from sliding down too quickly, prolonging the agony. In 1462, Vlad created his masterpiece of horror. When the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II approached Vlad's capital of Târgoviște with an army, he found 20,000 Turkish prisoners impaled in a forest of stakes outside the city. Men, women, and children were arranged in neat rows, their bodies in various stages of decay. The tallest stake held Hamza Pasha, the Ottoman commander. Vlad believed in hierarchical impalement, with higher-ranking victims getting taller stakes. This sight was so horrific that the Ottoman army, hardened warriors who had conquered Constantinople, refused to enter the city. Chroniclers reported that some stakes still held living victims, their moans creating a chorus of agony. The stench was overwhelming, a mixture of blood, feces, and rotting flesh that could be smelled miles away. Mehmed, who had seen countless battles, reportedly vomited at the sight and ordered his army to retreat. Vlad would sometimes have meals served while watching people being impaled. One story tells of foreign ambassadors who complained about the smell during such a dinner. Vlad had them impaled on especially tall stakes, joking that they would be above the smell up there. He allegedly impaled between 40,000 and 100,000 people during his reign. The Brazen Bull. The Brazen Bull took torture in a different direction. It turned agony into art. Created by Perillos of Athens for Phalaris, the tyrant of Acragas in Sicily, the Brazen Bull was a hollow bronze statue of a bull, large enough to hold a human being. A door in the side allowed the victim to be placed inside. Then a fire would be lit beneath the bull's belly. As the bronze heated up, the person inside would be slowly roasted alive. But the true genius of the device, and I use that word with disgust, was its acoustic design. The bull's head contained a complex system of tubes and pipes that would transform the victim's screams into what sounded like the bellowing of a bull. The more the victim screamed, the more the bull would seem to come alive, smoke pouring from its nostrils, bellowing echoing across the execution ground. According to legend, when Perillos presented his invention to Phalaris, the tyrant asked him to demonstrate the sound system. Perillos climbed inside to show how the pipes worked. Phalaris immediately locked the door and lit a fire beneath, making the inventor the first victim of his own creation. He was removed before death and thrown off a cliff, but the message was clear. Even the creators of torture devices weren't safe from them. The brazen bull killed through a combination of factors. The victim would first suffer from the extreme heat, their skin blistering and burning. As the temperature rose, they would begin to literally cook from the outside in. The metal would eventually become hot enough to cause their body fat to render, essentially frying them in their own fluids. Death would come from a combination of hypothermia, shock, and eventually the cooking of vital organs. What made the brazen bull particularly cruel was the performance aspect. The victim's agony became entertainment. Their screams transformed into the theatrical bellowing of the bronze beast. Crowds would gather to watch the bull come alive, smoke pouring from its nostrils, its bellowing growing louder as the victim's suffering intensified. These devices weren't just tools of torture, they were instruments of terror, designed to break not just bodies but spirits, to create such fear that entire populations would submit rather than risk facing them. They represent humanity at its absolute worst, the point where creativity and intelligence were turned entirely toward the goal of creating suffering. The men who operated these devices approached torture with the methodology of scientists, documenting what worked, what didn't, how long a person could endure each stage. They passed this knowledge down through generations, refining their techniques, improving their devices. They turned suffering into a profession. And here's what haunts me most. They worked exactly as intended. They extracted confessions, though those confessions were worthless, spoken only to stop the pain. They terrorized populations into submission. They created spectacles that burned themselves into collective memory, stories passed down through generations as warnings. The torture chambers of medieval Europe weren't hidden away in shame. They were part of the justice system, their use codified in law. The men who operated these devices weren't considered monsters. They were civil servants, paid salaries, given pensions. The crowds who gathered to watch weren't barbarians. They were ordinary people who brought their children to see justice being served. The screaming may have stopped, but the echoes remain.